Today, we are going to explore an important and deeply human concept in literature: sympathy. In simple terms, sympathy means the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. It is what allows readers to emotionally connect with characters, situations, and experiences across time and culture. In English literature, sympathy plays a powerful role. It helps writers create emotional depth, influences how we judge characters, and shapes the moral message of a text. From the tragedies of Shakespeare to modern literary criticism, sympathy has been used to evoke compassion, question society, and highlight human suffering. In this presentation, we will examine how sympathy developed, how it functions in different literary works, and why it remains essential for both writers and readers. Now let us clearly understand what sympathy means in literature. Sympathy is a literary device through which a writer makes the reader feel compassion, pity, or emotional concern for a character, a situation, or even an idea. In other words, the author carefully guides our emotions so that we begin to care about what is happening in the text. This emotional connection is not accidental. It is intentionally created through language, characterization, and narrative techniques. Sympathy works at three important levels. First, it is an aesthetic tool. This means it shapes our emotional experience as readers. When we feel sad for a tragic hero or moved by a suffering character, our reading becomes deeper and more engaging. Literature becomes not just something we read, but something we feel. Second, it acts as a moral mechanism. Sympathy influences how we judge characters and events. For example, even if a character makes mistakes, the writer may present their struggles in such a way that we still feel compassion for them. This challenges us to think about right and wrong in a more complex and human way. Third, it is a narrative strategy. Writers use sympathy to control how readers align themselves with certain characters or ideas. By making us sympathize with one character over another, the author shapes our understanding of the story and directs our emotional focus. So, sympathy is not just a feeling, it is a powerful technique that connects emotion, morality, and storytelling in literature. Now let us look at the origin and deeper meaning of the word sympathy. The term comes from Greek. It is made up of two parts: syn, which means together, and pathos, which means feeling. So, at its most basic level, sympathy means shared feeling. It suggests that one person is able to feel along with another, emotionally connecting with their experience. Over time, this simple idea developed into a rich philosophical concept. In classical thought, Aristotle connected sympathy to the emotions of pity and fear in tragedy. According to him, when we watch a tragic story, we feel pity for the suffering of the character and fear because we realize that such suffering could happen to us. These emotions lead to catharsis, which is a kind of emotional release or purification. This is one of the earliest explanations of how sympathy works in literature. Later, philosophers like David Hume explained sympathy as a kind of emotional transmission. He believed that emotions can pass from one person to another, almost like a natural human response. When we see someone suffering, we automatically begin to feel something similar within ourselves. Adam Smith took this idea further and described sympathy as moral imagination. He argued that we imagine ourselves in another person's situation, and this imaginative process allows us to understand and judge their feelings. In this way, sympathy becomes the basis of ethical thinking and human connection. So, if we look at its development, sympathy begins as a natural human emotion, a simple shared feeling, but gradually becomes a carefully crafted literary technique. Writers learn to shape and direct this emotional response in order to influence readers more effectively. Let us now trace how the idea of sympathy developed across different historical periods. We begin with the classical period, especially with Aristotle's Poetics. In this period, sympathy is closely connected to tragedy. Aristotle explains that tragedy evokes two main emotions: pity and fear. We feel pity for the suffering of the character, and fear because we recognize that such suffering could happen to us. These emotions lead to catharsis, which is a controlled emotional release. So, in this stage, Sympathy is not random. It is carefully shaped to create a balanced emotional purification in the audience. Next, in the medieval period, the concept of sympathy becomes deeply tied to religion. Literature during this time often focuses on the suffering of Christ and the lives of saints and martyrs. Readers are encouraged to feel sympathy toward these figures, not just as an emotional response, but as a spiritual exercise. Feeling compassion becomes a way of strengthening faith and moral understanding. So here, sympathy is connected to spiritual morality and devotion. Then we move to the Renaissance period, where there is a major shift. Literature becomes more human-centered, focusing on individual experience and complexity. Writers begin to explore the inner lives of characters in greater depth. William Shakespeare plays a crucial role in transforming sympathy during this time. He presents characters who are not perfect. They are flawed, conflicted, and deeply human. Yet, despite their mistakes, we still feel sympathy for them. This marks the beginning of psychological sympathy, where the reader is drawn into the mental and emotional struggles of characters, rather than simply reacting to their external situations. So, across these periods, we can see a clear development, from controlled emotional response in classical tragedy, to spiritual compassion in medieval literature, and finally to deep psychological understanding in the Renaissance. Now let us continue the historical development of sympathy from the 18th century to the modern period. In the 18th century, also known as the Age of Sensibility, emotion itself was considered a moral virtue. People believed that the ability to feel deeply for others showed goodness and humanity. During this time, sympathy became a central goal of literature. Writers deliberately tried to move the reader's heart. For example, Samuel Richardson in his novel Pamela creates situations that make readers feel intense sympathy for the heroine's struggles and virtue. Similarly, Lawrence Stern uses emotional scenes and personal reflection to draw readers into the inner feelings of his characters. So in this period, literature is designed to awaken sensitivity and emotional responsiveness. Moving to the Victorian period, sympathy takes on a more social purpose. Literature becomes a tool for reform. Writers begin to use sympathy not just to make readers feel, but to make them aware of social problems and inspire change. A key figure here is Charles Dickens. In his works, he exposes harsh realities like poverty, child labor, and social injustice. By making readers sympathize with suffering characters, especially children, he encourages them to think about the need for social reform. In this way, literature becomes a form of emotional activism, using sympathy to influence public opinion and moral responsibility. Finally, in the modern and contemporary period, the idea of sympathy becomes more complex and sometimes even questioned. Writers no longer present sympathy as simple or straightforward. For instance, George Orwell often shows how emotions, including sympathy, can be manipulated for political purposes. Similarly, Toni Morrison explores deep and painful histories, where sympathy is not easy or comfortable, but layered and challenging. In this period, sympathy becomes ambiguous. Readers are often forced to question their own emotional responses, why they feel sympathy, for whom, and whether that sympathy is justified. It is no longer just an emotional reaction, but also a critical and political experience. Now let us examine the core features of sympathy in literature. These are the key elements that help us understand how sympathy actually works within a text. The first feature is emotional appeal, also known as pathos. Sympathy strongly depends on the writer's ability to evoke emotions in the reader. Through descriptive language, powerful situations, and expressive characters, the author creates feelings such as pity, compassion, or sadness. This emotional appeal draws the reader into the story and makes the experience more intense and meaningful. The second feature is character identification. For sympathy to occur, readers must be able to connect with a character. This connection may come from shared experiences, relatable emotions, or a deep understanding of the character's struggles. Even if the character is very different from us, the writer presents their inner life in such a way that we begin to see the world from their perspective. The third feature is moral engagement. Sympathy is not just about feeling, it also involves judgment. When we sympathize with a character, we begin to think about their actions in a moral context. We may forgive their mistakes, question their decisions, or reflect on what is right and wrong. In this way, sympathy encourages deeper ethical thinking. The fourth feature is narrative manipulation. This means that sympathy is carefully controlled by the author. Writers decide what information to reveal, whose perspective to show, and how events are presented. By doing this, they guide the reader's emotions and influence whom we sympathize with and to what extent. The final feature is universality. Sympathy is a universal human experience. It can extend not only to different types of people but also beyond humans, to animals, nature, or even abstract ideas. Literature uses this universal quality to create connections across cultures, time periods, and different forms of life. Together, these features show that sympathy is not a simple emotion, but a complex and powerful literary device that shapes how we feel, think, and respond to a text. Now let us look at the important techniques writers use to create sympathy in literature. These are the methods through which authors guide our emotions and make us care about characters and situations. The first technique is the tragic flaw, also known as hamartia. This refers to a weakness or error in a character that leads to their downfall. Even though the character makes mistakes, we still feel sympathy because their suffering seems human and understandable. Their flaw makes them more real and relatable. The second technique is victimization. When a character is shown as a victim of circumstances, such as injustice, oppression, or fate, we naturally feel compassion for them. The more helpless or unfairly treated the character appears, the stronger our sympathy becomes. The third technique is innocence. Writers often use children or animals to evoke sympathy because they are seen as pure and defenseless. When such innocent beings suffer, it creates a strong emotional response in the reader, as it feels undeserved and deeply unfair. The fourth technique is inner monologue. By giving us access to a character's thoughts and feelings, the writer allows us to understand their inner struggles. This direct insight into the mind of the character helps us connect with them on a deeper emotional level. Next is backstory. When we learn about a character's past, their hardships, losses, or experiences, it helps us understand why they behave in a certain way. This background information builds empathy and makes us more sympathetic toward the present condition. Another important technique is irony. Sometimes, sympathy is created when there is a contrast between what a character deserves and what actually happens to them. For example, a good or innocent character suffering unjustly creates a strong emotional impact through irony. Finally, social injustice is a powerful technique. Writers highlight issues like poverty, inequality, or discrimination to evoke sympathy not just for individuals, but for entire groups. This often encourages readers to think critically about society and its flaws. All these techniques show that sympathy is carefully constructed. Writers use these tools deliberately to shape our emotional response and deepen our engagement with the text. Now we come to one of the most important parts of this topic: the major thinkers and practitioners who shaped the concept of sympathy in literature. Now let us focus on William Shakespeare and his unique contribution to the concept of sympathy in literature. Shakespeare's greatest achievement is that he creates sympathy for characters who are morally flawed. This is very important. Earlier literature often presented clear distinctions between good and bad characters. But Shakespeare breaks this pattern. His characters are complex, and even when they make serious mistakes, we still feel for them. The key idea here is that readers continue to sympathize with characters despite their faults. This is because Shakespeare shows their inner struggles, emotions, and psychological conflicts in a very realistic way. For example, in Macbeth, the character Macbeth is driven by ambition, which leads him to commit terrible crimes. However, we also see his guilt, fear, and mental disturbance. Because of this inner conflict, we do not see him as purely evil. We feel sympathy for his tragic condition. In King Lear, Lear makes poor decisions and misjudges his daughters. Yet, as he suffers, losing power, respect, and eventually his sanity, we begin to feel deep pity for him. His suffering makes him human in our eyes. In Othello, the protagonist is manipulated by Iago and falls into jealousy and doubt. Even though his actions lead to tragedy, we understand how he is deceived and emotionally vulnerable. This creates strong sympathy for him. From an exam point of view, the most important idea to remember is that Shakespeare creates psychological realism and emotional conflict. He presents characters as complex human beings, and this complexity is what generates deep and lasting sympathy in the reader. Now let us look at a completely different approach to sympathy through the work of Bertolt Brecht. Brecht strongly rejects the idea of emotional sympathy in traditional literature and drama. He believes that when audiences become too emotionally involved with characters, they stop thinking critically about the issues being presented. Instead of questioning society, they simply feel and move on. To counter this, Brecht introduces the concept of the alienation effect, also known as Verfremdungseffekt. The main purpose of this technique is to create a distance between the audience and the performance. His aim is very clear. He wants to prevent emotional immersion and instead encourage rational and political thinking. In other words, rather than feeling sympathy for characters, the audience should analyze the social conditions and question injustice. To achieve this, Brecht uses several important methods. First, he breaks the illusion of reality. The audience is constantly reminded that they are watching a play, not real life. Second, he uses direct address, where characters speak directly to the audience. This interrupts emotional involvement and creates awareness. Third, he employs an episodic structure. Instead of a continuous, emotionally engaging story, the narrative is broken into separate scenes, each highlighting a specific idea or issue. From an exam point of view, the key idea is this: Brecht replaces sympathy with critical awareness. He shifts the focus from feeling to thinking, from emotional involvement to intellectual engagement. Now let us examine a modern critical perspective on sympathy through the work of Judith Fetterley. In her important work The Resisting Reader, Fetterley presents a powerful idea that sympathy in literature is not neutral, but politically controlled. She argues that texts often guide readers to feel sympathy in a specific direction, especially in ways that support dominant ideologies. Her core idea is that literature frequently forces readers to align with a dominant perspective, particularly a male-centered viewpoint. As a result, readers may unconsciously adopt attitudes and emotions that reflect this perspective, even if it excludes or marginalizes other voices. At the same time, alternative responses, such as resistance, disagreement, or sympathy for marginalized characters, are often suppressed. This means that the reader's emotional response is being shaped and limited by the text itself. Fetterley introduces the important term, emasculation. This refers to the process by which female readers are made to identify with male perspectives in literature, effectively silencing their own viewpoints and emotional responses. From an exam point of view, the key takeaway is this: sympathy can function as a tool of ideological control. It is not just about feeling compassion, it can also influence how readers think, align, and respond within a larger social and political framework. Now let us look at the idea of universal sympathy through the work of Robert Burns. In his poem To a Mouse, Burns presents a very important idea, that sympathy is not limited to human beings, but extends to animals and all living creatures. This is a major expansion of the concept of sympathy in literature. The key idea here is that all forms of life share similar experiences, especially suffering and vulnerability. In the poem, the speaker feels deep compassion for a small mouse whose home has been destroyed. Instead of seeing the mouse as insignificant, he recognizes its struggle as meaningful and worthy of concern. This brings us to the major themes. First, shared suffering. Both humans and animals experience pain, loss, and uncertainty. Burns highlights this common condition, creating a bond between different forms of life. Second, the fragility of life. The poem shows how easily life can be disturbed or destroyed, whether it is human or animal. This creates a sense of humility and compassion. Third, equality of existence. Burns suggests that no life is truly insignificant. Every living being has value, and this idea encourages a broader, more inclusive form of sympathy. From an exam point of view, the key takeaway is this: Burns expands sympathy beyond the human world into an ecological and universal dimension. He invites readers to feel compassion not just for people, but for all living beings, making sympathy more inclusive and ethically powerful. Now let us bring all the major thinkers together through a comparative framework. This slide helps you quickly understand how different critics and writers interpret sympathy in literature. We begin with Aristotle. For him, sympathy is linked to emotional catharsis. Through pity and fear, literature creates a controlled emotional release in the audience. Next, William Shakespeare. He develops the idea further by presenting complex human sympathy. His characters are morally flawed, yet deeply human, and this psychological depth makes readers sympathize with them. Then, Charles Dickens. He uses sympathy as a tool for social reform. By making readers feel for the poor and oppressed, he highlights real social problems and encourages change. In contrast, Bertolt Brecht rejects sympathy. He believes emotional involvement can prevent critical thinking, so he replaces sympathy with rational and political awareness. Moving on, Judith Fetterley offers an ideological critique. She argues that sympathy is not neutral, it is controlled by dominant ideologies and can shape how readers think and respond. Finally, Robert Burns expands sympathy into a universal concept. His work shows that sympathy extends beyond humans to animals and all living beings, creating a broader ethical perspective. So, this comparison clearly shows that sympathy is not a single fixed idea. It evolves from emotional experience to psychological depth, social reform, political critique, and finally to a universal and inclusive concept. Now let us clearly differentiate sympathy from other closely related concepts. This is very important for exams because these terms are often confused. First, sympathy. Sympathy means feeling for others. Here, we recognize another person's suffering and feel concern or pity for them, but we still remain emotionally separate. We understand their pain, but we do not fully experience it ourselves. Next, empathy. Empathy goes a step further. It means feeling as others. In this case, we imagine ourselves in another person's position so deeply that we begin to experience their emotions from within. So, while sympathy is about concern, empathy is about emotional identification. Then, pathos. Pathos is not a feeling itself, but a technique used in literature. Writers use pathos to create emotional appeal and evoke sympathy in the reader. It is the method through which emotions like pity and compassion are generated. Finally, catharsis. This is the emotional effect produced after experiencing sympathy, especially in tragedy. As explained by Aristotle, catharsis is the release or purification of emotions like pity and fear. It is what the audience feels at the end of an intense emotional experience. So, to summarize clearly, sympathy is the feeling, empathy is deeper emotional identification, pathos is the technique that creates that feeling, and catharsis is the final emotional outcome. Understanding these distinctions helps us analyze literature more precisely and effectively. Now let us clearly differentiate sympathy from other closely related concepts. This is very important for exams because these terms are often confused. First, sympathy. Sympathy means feeling for others. Here, we recognize another person's suffering and feel concern or pity for them, but we still remain emotionally separate. We understand their pain, but we do not fully experience it ourselves. Next, empathy. Empathy goes a step further. It means feeling as others. In this case, we imagine ourselves in another person's position so deeply that we begin to experience their emotions from within. So, while sympathy is about concern, empathy is about emotional identification. Then, pathos. Pathos is not a feeling itself, but a technique used in literature. Writers use pathos to create emotional appeal and evoke sympathy in the reader. It is the method through which emotions like pity and compassion are generated. Finally, catharsis. This is the emotional effect produced after experiencing sympathy, especially in tragedy. As explained by Aristotle, catharsis is the release or purification of emotions like pity and fear. It is what the audience feels at the end of an intense emotional experience. So, to summarize clearly, sympathy is the feeling, empathy is deeper emotional identification, pathos is the technique that creates that feeling, and catharsis is the final emotional outcome. Understanding these distinctions helps us analyze literature more precisely and effectively. Now let us move to some high-level critical insights. These points are extremely important for advanced understanding and for writing strong answers in exams. The first insight is that sympathy is constructed. This means emotions in literature are not natural or accidental, they are carefully engineered by the author. Through techniques like characterization, narrative perspective, and language, writers deliberately shape how and for whom we feel. So, sympathy is a crafted response, not just a spontaneous feeling. The second insight is that sympathy is political. This means not everyone receives equal sympathy in literature. The question of who gets sympathy often reflects power structures in society. Certain groups or perspectives are highlighted, while others may be ignored or suppressed. As critics like Judith Fetterley argue, sympathy can reinforce dominant ideologies. The third insight is the tension between sympathy and critical distance. In traditional literature, the aim is emotional immersion. We are encouraged to fully feel with the characters. But in modern drama, especially in the works of Bertolt Brecht, this idea is challenged. Brecht promotes resistance instead of immersion, encouraging the audience to think critically rather than simply feel. The fourth insight is the expansion of sympathy over time. In classical literature, sympathy is mainly directed toward heroic figures. In the Victorian period, writers like Charles Dickens expand sympathy toward the poor and marginalized. In modern literature, sympathy often includes anti-heroes, complex, flawed individuals. And in the work of Robert Burns, sympathy extends even beyond humans to all living beings. So, these insights show that sympathy is dynamic. It evolves across time, reflects power structures, and shifts from pure emotion to a more critical and complex concept. Now let us conclude the entire discussion by bringing all the ideas together into one clear understanding. Sympathy in literature begins with Aristotle, where it is connected to catharsis, the emotional release created through pity and fear in tragedy. At this stage, sympathy is a controlled emotional experience. It then develops further in the works of William Shakespeare, where we see deep psychological complexity. Here, sympathy is extended even to flawed characters, making it more human and realistic. In the Victorian period, writers like Charles Dickens transform sympathy into a tool for social reform. It is used to highlight injustice and create awareness about real social issues. This traditional emotional approach is then challenged by Bertolt Brecht, who rejects sympathy and instead promotes critical thinking through his anti-emotional theatre. Later, critics like Judith Fetterley question sympathy itself, arguing that it can function as a tool of ideological control, shaping how readers think and respond. Finally, in the poetry of Robert Burns, sympathy expands into a universal concept, extending beyond human beings to include all forms of life. So, overall, sympathy is not a fixed idea. It evolves across time, from emotional experience to psychological depth, from social tool to political critique, and finally into a universal ethical principle.